Not Even the Dead by Toft, read by the author. Prologue. Hippotios spat blood onto the marble floor and grinned, or at least he did until a Persian boot caught him in the ribs. The blow rolled him onto his back, causing him a bloom of pain in his left shoulder, which beat counterpoint to the aching of his ribs. Both of the hurts were lost in the cacophony of pain that was the rest of his body. Every part of him was screaming in response to the beatings he had received. Again, the Persian officer said. Soldiers pulled Hippotios to his feet. Two held him while a third pummeled him with fists. He noted distantly that the actions of the men had slowed. When the session had begun, they had been eager for Greek blood and determined to make him talk. Now they moved like wary veterans who had been ordered to beat an old man to death. They were seasoned men and had realized what the officer had not. Hippotios had beaten them. Eretria was fallen. The king was dead, as was the queen. But in their personal struggle, Hippotios had defeated the Persian officer. They had not been able to force him to speak, and enough time had passed that it no longer mattered. Halt, the officer called out again, and the soldiers stopped beating him. Look, the officer said to Hippotios in a wheezing tone, you must be tired of my men hitting you. Just tell me what I need to know, and they will stop. Tell me where the boy is. Hippotios laughed at him. By now he is no doubt in Athens, eating grapes and listening to old men dither about philosophy. It wasn't true, but he had put King Damocles' heir Demetrius on a donkey and told his own son to take him south to Athens nearly an hour ago. If the Persians hadn't caught them yet, they never would, not two Greek boys in these Greek hills. Monimos knew them like the back of his hand, and Hippotios had faith in him. The officer leaned in close, locking eyes as if the knowledge he sought could be found there. The man's hair and beard were well oiled, and his scaled bronze armor shined brilliantly. Unlike the soldiers supporting him, the officer seemed untouched by the fighting that had swept the city. Hippotios spat blood again, this time into the officer's face. The man fell back with a screech of horror and revulsion. Hippotios smirked. The man was clearly no soldier. No doubt his commission had come as a boon from a friend in the Persian royal court. The man might even be a member of the court himself. The thought made him regret that he had been unable to kill the officer. Hippotios' assault on the officer earned him another beating from the soldiers, this time with the butt of a spear. He barely felt it. He had arrived in a place beyond pain. What he felt instead was weariness. He knew what was coming next, and he wished the Persians would just get it over with. The officer wiped the blood off his face with his cloak. You'll regret that, he spat at Hippotios. Hippotios laughed at the Persian fool. Take this dog to the wall. He is of no further use to us, the officer screamed at his men. Hippotios' hands were efficiently tied behind him. He thought of making the soldiers drag him out of the palace, but decided instead to face his end in a more dignified manner. He was 59 summers old, and despite his excellent health, he would have been described as ancient by any citizen of Eretria, including himself. He had lived a long and full life and had little fear of death. He had faced it many times on the field of battle. A struggle would have no effect on the outcome, and he did not want the Persians to interpret his struggle as fear. The soldiers led the skinny old man, who had been stripped of weapons and armor, out of the palace, and Hippotios witnessed Eretria being put to the sword. The palace itself was still intact, but the rest of the city was in flames. The market was already ashes, and the garrison, where he had lived for most of his adult life, was smoldering. He saw few people besides Persians. There were some Greek women and children sitting dejectedly in groups, watched by Persian guards. They would be carried off as slaves. There were no men. Virtually every male over the age of 10 had been put to the sword when the Persians took the city. As they passed a group of prisoners, one of the women called out to him, Could not King Damocles bend the knee to Darius? Was one man's pride truly worth all of this? She shouted at him bitterly. He did not answer her, because doing so would simply have caused them both to be beaten. He did not begrudge her asking, though. The king was dead, and it was not surprising she would want answers from the king's general. One of the soldiers guarding the prisoners cuffed the woman, not for speaking, but for mentioning the Persian emperor without referencing his supposed divinity. Hippotios supposed she would learn soon enough. Damocles had yielded to the Persian emperor when the impossibly large army had appeared at their gates. It had been too little, too late. A year before, a Persian envoy had arrived in Eretria demanding tribute, and both he and the king had laughed at the man. Persia had seemed so far away at the time, practically at the end of the world. Athens and Sparta had both promised the smaller polis protection should war come to Greece. That promise had gone unfulfilled, not out of any malice by the other cities, but because the Persians had arrived faster and in more number anyone had believed was possible. They reached the city wall. It was 14 feet high and cut from rough granite rather than the polished marble that was used in the wealthier buildings in Eretria. It was an impressive wall for a city of Eretria's population, though it was useless against an army the size of the Persian force. The wall had not been breached. The Persians had entered the city as part of Eretria's unconditional surrender. The Persians manhandled Hippotios onto the edge. He looked over it, at the countryside, his long gray hair blowing in the night wind. From the top of the wall, Hippotios could see the Persian army covering the field to the north of the city. The army was supposed to contain 500,000 men. When he had first been told that number, he had thought it ridiculous and impossible. Now with the Persian forces arrayed before him, with the enemy soldiers stretching beyond his ability to see, he believed. One of the soldiers placed a rope around his neck. He did not resist. Another soldier spoke gruffly from behind him. Any last words? Hippotios thought about it. Eretria is not the only polis in Greece, he said. We will be avenged. Greece will prevail. He spoke the words without truly believing them. Unceremoniously, one of the Persians kicked him in the small of the back. He remained rigid as he fell over the side of the wall. With his arms bound behind him, he couldn't flail around anyway. He didn't fall far. With a painful wrench, the rope seized around his neck, stopping his descent. Darkness closed in on him slowly. If his hands had not been bound behind him, he would have clawed at his throat. As his vision darkened, he could hear the Persian soldiers making conversation above him in their foreign tongue. His last thoughts were of his son.